no one in really in kind of traditional mainstream media who was really kind of looking into some of the disinformation that was going on in a systematic way. So I just ended up falling into doing it. And I think as I think the biggest and most important theme I think of the work that I've done over the last year or more is really the kind of the intersecting uh, nature of pre-existing lobby groups that have latched on to the pandemic as essentially in a way which has allowed them to try and amplify already existing practices of disinformation. So we're all probably very familiar with, the Great Barrington Declaration and the stuff about that. And I broke the story about how this declaration was, um, set up by this organized right-wing libertarian think tank in the United States, the American Institute for Economic Research, and that this group had also, received extensive funding and support from the Koch network. Um, Now that's really interesting because the Koch network is very well known for having been involved in muddying science. And it has a long history of doing this. For example, in terms of climate change, they're one of the biggest funders of climate science denial. They've also been in cahoots with the tobacco industry, and they've been involved in other kind of environmental health issues, kind of combating environmental health legislation in relation to big oil. So that's really interesting context. And then it kind of gives us a sense to understand why it is that this network would take this particular approach to the pandemic. Um, and so what I've from looking at the Great Barrington Declaration, the other interesting thing is to see how that network has essentially kind of, because it's a pre-existing network, what we found is that in different parts of the world, these types of right-wing libertarian groups have ended up gravitating towards kind of this kind of, COVID skepticism, lockdown skepticism, and so on and so forth. And what might start off as kind of raising, some kind of maybe narrow scientific questions about specific things. Maybe we need to change this. Maybe we need to look at this. Maybe we need to think about uh, certain regulations or things like that. Maybe it's just about masks, or it starts with something small, but what you find is then it kind of gravitates and escalates into kind of an ideology. Um, and I think one of the most dangerous things that we're seeing is how these groups are activating internationally. And because we're dealing with pre-existing networks, we're not talking about we're not just talking about kind of like ad hoc kind of a lot of it is of course ad hoc to some extent, but we're talking about networks which have actually for quite a long time, if not decades, have become very proficient in dealing with disinformation, and they have pre-existing networks to do that. So there is a vast network of think tanks, there is a vast amount of funding. There were pre-existing lobbying networks with politicians and specific political parties, and those networks and were then activated during the pandemic. With obviously quite insidious results. And I think what as journalists, what we've done is we've had to catch up to kind of say, oh, it's these networks, and in hindsight, we can now see that it actually some of this was quite predictable. If we had been able to step back and think, we could have maybe gone back in time and said, well, this is if there was a pandemic, what would have happened? Well, these groups would have been activated, and this would have. So, in a way, it seems quite predictable. But obviously, in the heat of the moment, it was very difficult to see what was going on. But I think now we can see that these very same networks that were active before have now been activated. So it's quite interesting to see that we have these international networks. We have, across in the United States, in Britain, in Sweden, we have clear interlinkages. And what's interesting is that this Great Barrington ideology, this focus protection idea, the kind of the herd immunity idea and the skepticism towards masks, skepticism towards vaccines. There's a number of very loud groups that I think, and people that have kind of been quite active and kind of, I would say, act as kind of nodes in this network. And I think obviously the Great Barrington Declaration was one. I think the role of Sweden, which I heard Wendy was talking about Sweden earlier, and Sweden, and I think the role of some of the senior kind of people in the medical establishment there were, I think there was Johan Gazai, I don't know how to pronounce his surname, Gazai, who is advises the World Health Organization, a very influential. Giseki, yeah, thank you so much. He is obviously, he is a proponent of herd immunity by natural infection, and also sits on the board of World Health in terms of the scientific advisory group dealing with infectious diseases and so forth, and advising on that. Now we know that they were very close to people involved in the Great Barrington Declaration. We had a Swedish official speak alongside a founder of the Great Barrington Declaration, Sunetra Gupta, to Boris Johnson in September when they were trying to kind of delay a lockdown and kind of stop kind of school closures and things like that. And we also know that we had some of these officials speaking to Indian officials a couple of months ago before the big kind of outbreak really took off there with the Delta variant. And at the same time, we have the kind of intersections with kind of the Brexit lobby, the pre-existing Brexit lobby, kind of the hard right of the Conservative Party in the UK. So we have this kind of, and so we have this kind of interesting link between things going on in the United States with the Republicans, the Conservative Party, and the right of the Conservative Party with kind of UKIP and Reform Party, so-called Reform Party and so on, and the rest of it. And of course, kind of mainstream parties in Sweden and other parties in Europe. So there is an international network here. I'm conscious that I'm supposed to only take 10 minutes, but I guess what I wanted to say was there is a sophistication in that sense to these groups. They are able to draw on existing lobbying networks, existing ways of operating think tanks to generate credibility for the narratives that they're pushing forward. And these are quite tried and tested approaches. And in that sense, there is I think what we've realized is that we don't have an equivalent response on that scale. These groups are quite familiar with operating internationally, operating in a transatlantic way. And I think we've seen the quite surprising and effective results of that process with the kind of rapid changes that they can and rapid successes that they can have, with the election of the Trump administration, the things that have happened since Brexit, and the impacts on Europe. I think we're seeing that there are these big disruptive changes that can happen in a very short space of time as a result of the activities of these groups. So I think the challenge that we have is to find ways of coordinating in a similar way, but not in the same way, but in a similar way. We need to find ways of coordinating effectively internationally, mobilizing networks and mechanisms to reach politicians and to reach media in ways that, in a sense, that can outmaneuver these organizations. And to some extent, I think we can learn from some of the things that they have done. But I also think that there are ways of doing it which can be improved on. We can do things better. We can do things with a different model, and we can do it in a way to kind of enrich discussion, enrich debate, and enrich kind of the participation of ordinary citizens.
Great, thank you very much, Nafeez. I put up a link to